Good afternoon and welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We're talking Streamlined organization in Lightroom Classic with the man himself, Tim Gray. Tim, what's happening? How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good. For all of our viewers out there, Tim made a point in the green room to opine over how he misses getting harassed about all the things that he can't fix for everybody in Lightroom. So make sure you send him a ton of emails. Tim's like, that's it. This is the last event space I ever do again. but Tim's going to take us through a great organizational tutorial, hint on some great tips. And if you've ever seen any of Tim's events, you know he's a wealth of knowledge. So we really appreciate you being here, Tim. If you do have real questions for him and not just complaints, even if you have a little bit of complaining, get him in. We're more than happy to answer them for you. You can use the Q&A tab here on Zoom. And if you're joining us on Vimeo or Facebook, you can use the comment section. But I know Tim's got a lot to cover. So I'll just say thanks again for being here, and I'll shimmy out of the way for you.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate the intro and appreciate you making lots of time, because I always have way too much to say, it feels like. And more often than not, I feel like I keep going and going and going, but I know we've got a time limit, so I will jump right in. And we'll start off by sharing my screen here so that we can take a look at Lightroom Classic in just a moment. Just a brief intro for those of you who don't know me necessarily, maybe are not one who has seen me back in the days of live and in person at the event space, or haven't been joining some of these virtual presentations in the meantime. You can find out more. I love photography. I love being organized. I'm very particular about being organized. I'm also really lazy. And so I try to take a shortcut, as it were. I try to make sure that I'm really organized, but without too much work involved. And so I'm going to show you some tips for streamlining your workflow, helping to avoid some of the common mistakes, I would say, and I'll share tips along the way related to that. But if you want to learn more about what I'm doing, what I've been up to, my video training courses, where I'm going to be speaking and all that good stuff, you can find me at timgrayphoto.com. I want to start off, though, first and foremost, with a rule. Now, I'm not really big on rules. Well, I like breaking rules, but when it comes to rules in Lightroom Classic, there is one rule that I think is absolutely critical. So if you've run into any problems in Lightroom Classic, there's a very good chance that it was a result of not following this rule, which would be that when you're using Lightroom Classic, rule number one is that you've got to make sure that you're initiating everything in Lightroom Classic. If you want to rename a photo, rename a folder, move a photo, anything at all, you want to edit a photo in Photoshop, don't open it in Photoshop, send it from Lightroom Classic over to Photoshop. So just make sure that every single task that you're performing related to your images start in Lightroom Classic. There might be very rare exceptions where a particular task is not possible, but I promise you, if you try to make sure that everything you're doing with your images you're initiating in Lightroom Classic, it'll save you a whole lot of headaches down the road. I'll mention star ratings here just a little bit later as well, but I want to dive right into Lightroom Classic and into an organizational workflow. And, along the way in my workflow, when I'm organizing my photos, I want to try to make sure that I'm covering all the bases, that I don't forget things. And so, for example, when I'm traveling, especially for photography, very often I'm busy. The days are long and I'm out there for sunrise all the way till sunset. Maybe I'm lucky enough to get a nap in between, but I don't have a whole lot of time in the off hours, as it were, to do anything other than eat and catch up on sleep. And so I very often, when I'm traveling, don't have the opportunity to review my photos as much as I might like, to identify favorites and identify my outtakes and all of those various tasks, even updating metadata. And so sometimes in the past, I would find that I get back from a trip, and then a couple months later, I would realize that I had not yet reviewed some of the photos from a particular trip. So one of the really small, but I think really important pieces of my own workflow is to mark my photos in a way that I know which images have not yet been reviewed, which images I still need to go through and decide, is this a favorite? Is it an outtake? Should I show it off on Instagram or maybe delete it? Those two extremes, I suppose. And so I want to try and make sure that I'm not forgetting to review any of my photos. The approach that I use, and I'll talk more about marking photos in various ways a little bit later as we get more into the workflow here. But what I use to identify the photos that I've not yet reviewed is a red color label. Red stands out nicely, and it sort of has this notion of warning. make sure that you're doing something here. There's something that needs to be done. And so I use the red label as a marker to tell me this photo still needs to be evaluated to decide if it's a favorite or if it's an outtake. And that means that I need to first off understand how color labels work. And I also, again, want to try to be as efficient as possible, to be as streamlined in that workflow. And so based on this notion, to me, it makes a lot of sense to assign a red color label to every single photo that I import into Lightroom Classic. By definition, those are new photos that I haven't worked with yet in Lightroom Classic. And so I want to mark them with that red color label so I know these new photos need to be reviewed. And as you'll see a little bit later, we can actually use a metadata preset to assign color labels, among other metadata, to our photos right at the time that we're importing them. So as we're adding those photos to our catalog, we're able to actually assign metadata information. And part of that for me is a red color label. I encourage you to consider whether this might be a helpful addition to your workflow as well. So first, we'll take just a brief little detour here and take a look at what I always find to be a little bit amusing, but that is the color label definitions. So here in Lightroom Classic, I'm going to go to the metadata menu and I'll go to color label set, and you'll see, funny enough, there's different default settings. These are presets essentially for Adobe Bridge versus Lightroom, or in this context, Lightroom Classic. We can choose edit in order to bring up a dialog where we can review and update this information. So I'm just going to click edit there and bring up the dialog. And you'll see that for the Lightroom default preset, which I'm currently using, and that is the default, pretty straightforward here, nothing too surprising. A red color label has the word red in metadata. And what you might not be aware of is that the metadata, the color label in metadata, it's not really a color. It's just a field. It's a text field. Think of it almost like a keyword field. It just kind of gets one word more or less. And so we're not actually assigning a color, we're assigning a word, and then Lightroom in this case will interpret the word. It'll essentially look up, and if it says red in the metadata field, the label field, then it knows that's the name that is associated with the red color label. It might mean that it's very, very obvious. Obviously, it seems a little bit silly even for me to talk about this. Well, what's even sillier is when I talk about it in the context of the bridge default settings, where a red color label gets the word select in metadata, and yellow is second, and green is approved, and blue is review, and purple is to do. Pretty silly, but this is what Adobe decided to do way back in the early days when Bridge was first released, whereas for Lightroom, they came to their senses essentially and used something a little bit more logical. And the reason I point this out, in addition to having a little bit of fun with the silliness of what those bridge defaults are, is also to make sure that if you're going to use a color label in the way I'm going to show you, you need to know what the actual definitions are. So if you're using the Lightroom defaults, pretty straightforward. The word red, for example, for the red color label, you could choose a different color if you prefer, or if you're using red for some other purpose, for example. But I'm going to use red. I know that it's the word red, but take a look, make sure that those definitions are set as you would expect them, or at least so you know what the word is for the next step. So I'm just going to cancel to not make any changes there, and we'll go back up to the menu and go to the metadata menu once again. And this time we'll take a look at the metadata presets. So I'll choose metadata followed by edit metadata presets, and that will bring up a dialog. And the settings here will default to the currently selected image. So you might see a bit of random metadata. The key here is to understand that you can pick and choose which metadata you'll want to update. Now, a metadata preset could be assigned to an image virtually at any time in your workflow, but I recommend assigning it right at the time that you're importing your brand new photos into Lightroom Classic so that you're able to add whatever information you feel is important to every single image as soon as it's being imported into your catalog. I sometimes wish that it would be appropriate, for example, for me to assign a 5-star rating to every single image right at import. That might help my self-esteem just a little bit, but as you can probably appreciate, not all of my photos, in fact, nearly none of my photos deserve a 5-star rating. And so when we're updating a metadata or creating a metadata preset, it's important to keep in mind that we're applying this in a sort of generic way, possibly to every single photo you import. And so you want relatively generic information here. So as a very general rule, I would say contact information, copyright information, and in my case, a color label as well. And in fact, I have a preset. So I'll click the preset pop-up at the top of the dialog here and choose my preset. And you can see I've added some basic copyright information here. I've added some basic contact information, at least very rudimentary contact information there. I could add additional details. And so, put in my address or my what shall my job title be? I'll make that photographer. And as soon as I add a new field, when I put in new information into an empty field, the checkbox over to the right gets turned on automatically. When you create a metadata preset, only the values that have that checkbox turned on will be included and therefore will be updated. And so, for example, if we go back up here to the top, you see that star rating, which is set to 0 stars, but the checkbox is turned off. And so I'm not going to be changing the star rating of the images at import, for example, in this particular case. So you can go through the various fields here. Again, keep in mind that you probably want to only use fairly general information, your contact information, so potential clients can find out how to reach out to you, your copyright information, so that hopefully no one will steal your photos, and again, that color label. So here I've put the text that I found in the color label definitions, the word red in my case, very simple and straightforward, and then make sure that the checkbox is turned on. So any of the fields that I actually want to assign the metadata updates for my images. And so I would say for most photographers, in my experience, you probably only need one metadata preset. But if you sometimes doing commercial work versus personal work, or if you do commercial photography, maybe wedding photography, for example, and you have a second shooter, you might want a different metadata preset for each of those photographers. So there's certainly scenarios where you might have more than one, but in general, I think for most photographers, one is just fine. And then once you've defined, and again, you can go through all of these different fields and see if there are any additional details. There's quite a lot of information available here, but if there's any other details that you feel would be appropriate to add, to assign to your photos at import, you can certainly update those fields, turn on the check boxes over on the far right, just for the fields you want to include. And then once you have that preset defined, that metadata defined, we can come up to the preset pop-up and then choose to save the current settings as a new preset. That'll bring up a very simple dialog where you can type in a name. Just give it a meaningful name so you know why that preset exists. You may recall mine was just called Tim Gray Import. That's my name, and it's for import. It's when I'm assigning metadata upon import. But you could create these metadata presets for a variety of different purposes if you wanted to. In this case, I already have my preset, so I'll just go ahead and click the cancel button, and I'll go ahead and choose my preset there once again, just so that you can review here. My red color label, my basic copyright information, my contact information. Obviously, I could put in a mailing address and my phone number if I wanted to, etc., and any other details that I might include. But here, pretty straightforward, pretty minimal, but I think helpful to get some of that information added to metadata right from the start. And again, for me, the most important thing is that red color label. So since I already have that metadata preset, I'll leave that alone. I'll click the done button to close the dialog. And then another option that's available, as you'll see shortly at import, is the ability to update the appearance of an image using a develop module preset. And so if I've got an image here that I've not worked on, probably maybe this one, for example, I started off with an image that I've not applied ideally any adjustments to. That's a JPEG. Do we have? Oh, that's also a JPEG. Oh, I guess these are maybe all JPEG images. Let's go to a different folder here and we'll find this image I think I've not touched. So I'll go to the develop module with an image that I've not applied any adjustments to, basically an image where I don't care about the adjustments. So it doesn't necessarily need to be one that you've never applied any adjustments to, but one where you're willing to reset the adjustments to their defaults so that you can update the default settings with a new develop preset. And so I'll go ahead and click the reset button down at the bottom of the right panel here in the develop module. And that will reset, and I can see there were a couple of minor adjustments there. And now I can go through and change any of the settings from their defaults that I would like to update. And so I recommend that you consider, are there adjustment settings that you frequently tend to adjust? For me personally, I do like the clarity adjustment in the presence section here within the basic set of controls. So I might boost that clarity maybe by like 20 points or so. Vibrance, I might take up a little bit higher, even maybe, 30 plus 30, something along those lines. And so any settings where you feel that you'd like the defaults essentially to be something different, I'll go into the detail section. I do like to increase the value for smoothness for noise reduction. I generally use a pretty strong setting for that, even if I've not increased the value for color noise reduction. I like to turn on the profile-based lens corrections. So in the lens correction section, on the profile tab here, I turn on the remove chromatic aberration checkbox, as well as that profile corrections checkbox, and then just set the pop-up to auto so that the preset for the lens, the profile for the lens itself will be selected based on the metadata, based on which lens you actually used. And you could go through and find other adjustments. Maybe you like to add a little bit of contrast or whatever the case might be. The point is that you can go through with a sample image, as it were, and find the adjustments that you prefer to change by default, that you prefer to have a starting point that's a little different from the Lightroom Classic defaults. Once you've done that, once you've applied those adjustments, and we can come over to the left panel in the Develop module, and to the right of the presets heading, you'll find a little plus button there where we can choose to create a preset. That will bring up a dialog where, once again, you can give that preset a name. So, Tim Gray import, for example. You might notice I already have one over here on the left panel, so I don't really need to save this one. I can choose which group I want to put it in, which is essentially a folder, as it were, the sections over here on the left panel. And then I can pick and choose which adjustments I want to apply, which for the most part means which adjustments did I just change the settings for. And so what I generally do here is click the check none button in order to turn off the various adjustments. And then I'll go through and turn on the options that I took advantage of. So clarity and vibrance and our color noise reduction setting that I changed, and our chromatic aberration and profile based adjustments. And was there anything else? I think that may have been it. You can also choose whether or not you want to enable auto settings, which means that Lightroom will analyze the image and then apply automatic adjustments for the basic settings, the blacks, whites, highlights, and shadows, for example. I sometimes vacillate on this. Typically, I would probably leave it turned off. I actually, in my own workflow, have two different presets, one with and one without, so I can pick and choose. Just a matter of personal preference there. But the point is that we're able to then apply this develop preset right at import so that we're updating the images. Now, for me, it's mostly just taking some of the adjustment settings and going beyond the defaults based on what I typically do with my images. You could take that to a little bit more of an extreme. For example, some photographers process everything to a black and white interpretation. And so you could create a preset that converts the image to black and white. If it's a raw capture, of course, well, regardless of whether or not it's a raw capture, but in Lightroom Classic, it's still non-destructive. We can still go back and convert the image back to color, even though we've applied a preset that makes the image black and white at import. So anything you'd like to do, you obviously could have multiple different presets that you use in different scenarios for different types of photography, for example. For me, it's pretty simple. Just some of the settings that I like to change from the defaults. Again, that's a preset that I've already created. So I'm just going to click the cancel button in order to not create yet another preset that I don't really need. And then before we dive into the import, I do want to talk just briefly about the overall folder structure, which we will define within the import dialog. And first and foremost, I guess I should point out, this is just a demo catalog. This has just over 1,000 photos in it. This is just for demonstration purposes. My real catalog has almost 400,000 photos in it. And so with a lot of photos, I need some organization. And one of the really basic ways that we can organize our photos is to create a folder structure, to define a folder structure so that we're storing photos that belong together all within a single folder. And I think it's important to give some thought to what sort of folder structure works best for you. And the general way that I recommend approaching this is that your folder structure should probably be based on how you think about your photos. For me, usually my photography involves travel. And so if I'm thinking about a particular photo, looking for a particular photo, I'm generally thinking about where I went when I captured that photo. Whales I photographed in Alaska and Hawaii, for example, and crop dusters that I photographed in the Palouse, and, you know, architecture maybe in Italy, you know, whatever the case might be. For me, when I'm looking for a photo, I'm usually thinking about where I was when I captured the image. And so by and large, a location-based folder structure tends to work pretty well for me. For some photographers, not me, but for some photographers, a date-based structure works. I can't remember what day of the week it is. I sometimes forget what year it was. I'm really bad at guessing how long ago something happened. If I think it was 5 years ago, it was probably actually 10 years ago. And so for me, date-based folders don't work. If they work for you, I'm impressed. That's fantastic. Another example would be wedding photographers. Well, this one's pretty easy, because if you're a wedding photographer, you could just create folders based on the name of the client, maybe the last name first, for example. Or if you're an advertising photographer, you could create folders based on the companies that you're working for, or the products that you're photographing, or whatever makes sense in that regard. The point is to be thoughtful about the folder structure so that you take a consistent approach, and so that you start the folder names with whatever it is that's most important, because the folders within the folder list in Lightroom Classic in the library module, those are going to sort alphabetically. And so by date, that of course means you probably want to start with the year, then the month, then the day as numbers, not as, for example, the name of the month, because those are not alphabetical. And so using a structure that makes sense to you, and using that structure consistently, so that when you're looking for something, scrolling alphabetically on the list, you'll be more likely to be able to find it. And while I'm not a date person in that regard, notice that, of course, when I visited the same location more than once, I'll have a year, or maybe a year and a month, associated with that folder, so that I can differentiate different trips, for example. I also strongly recommend, to the extent that it's possible, that you store all of your photos, and therefore all of these folders, on a single hard drive in a single general location. So that could be an external hard drive that you have dedicated for just photos. It could be a photos folder on an external hard drive that you share with other types of data. It could be the pictures folder in your operating system. But if at all possible, try to have a single overall location where you're storing all of your photos, and then use a folder structure to help to keep those a little bit more organized. At least it's a very basic starting point for tracking down a particular photo. And, you know, I should hasten to point out that one of the advantages to using that folder structure is that the folder structure exists beyond Lightroom Classic. So even if for any reason you were to lose your Lightroom Classic catalog, you would still have the folder structure out on your hard drive. So you've got something to fall back on. Obviously, we're all backing up our Lightroom Classic catalog, being very careful with that, but I do like having that extra peace of mind of knowing that there's a base level organization happening right on my hard drive. All right, so let's go ahead. Now that we've talked about that a little bit, we have enough of the pieces put together here that we can import some photos into Lightroom Classic. So I'll go ahead and click the import button down at the bottom of the left panel in the library module, and that will bring up the import dialog. And one of the things that I recommend is that you fully leverage import. I hear from a lot of photographers who download photos to their computer, then they might use other software to sort through the images, delete their outtakes, assign star ratings, and then eventually they'll import them into Lightroom Classic and continue their workflow. To me, that's creating more sort of clutter. It's creating a little bit more of a cumbersome workflow. I want to get my photos into Lightroom Classic as soon as possible. I'll use Lightroom to review those photos. And so I'm very eager. As soon as I've got new photos on a memory card, I want to get those images into Lightroom. I want to get them backed up. I want to start reviewing them ideally. So I recommend fully leveraging import. Import your photos as soon as possible after capturing them. Part of the reason for that is to make sure that you're backing up those photos and that you're initiating that workflow as early as possible, and not creating this kind of convoluted approach where you're using different software applications at different stages of your workflow. So within the import dialog, fairly straightforward here. Over on the left side, we're going to select the source. You can see that because I have a media card in a card reader, Lightroom Classic automatically set that as the source. And in this case, using a folder structure, so just the top level of the folder structure that contains photos. But then there's an include subfolders checkbox. So you generally want that turned on. Obviously, there's some exceptions, but in the case of a media card, a lot of cameras will divide photos after every 100 photos or 1,000 photos. They might create a subfolder on the memory card. So just to make sure you're getting all of the photos, have that include subfolders checkbox turned off. And a convenience setting here, eject after import, so that you don't have to go through your operating system to safely remove the media card from the card reader. Lightroom Classic will take care of that for you. And then at the top center, the basic options here, I know there's 4 of them. I wish there were only 2, frankly. So the first would be copy, and the other option that might be available, depending on the scenario, is add. I wish that they would just remove the move option, because to me, whenever I think about moving an important file, like a photo, I don't move it, I copy it, and then I'll delete the original or move it into a backup folder or something like that. So I'd rather copy from the media card so that as soon as I've imported, I still have a media card as essentially at least a short-term backup. So copy is to copy photos from one location to another, typically from a media card to a hard drive. And then add is an option you would use when the photos are already where they belong. So if you've scanned some old slides and put them into a folder on your Photos hard drive, for example, now you want to import the images in that folder into Lightroom Classic, that's a scenario where you would use the add option, because those photos presumably have been saved into the location where you actually want to keep them. I don't convert to DNG. I'd rather keep the files exactly as they came out of the camera. If you want to use DNG, I would personally use that later in your workflow. And then over on, and by the way, I'm importing all photos. Sometimes I get a question about, if I've got 2 different sets of photos, can I import the first half into one folder, second half into another folder? Yes, that's possible. We can turn off the checkboxes for photos in order to not import some of them. My recommendation is import all of them. And then within Lightroom Classic, you can split those up into other folders as needed. Again, I just want to get this workflow happening as early as possible. All right, and then over on the far right-hand side, on the right panel, we start off at the top right with the general location where we're importing. So if we click, this is actually a pop-up, and we can select the destination where we want to copy our photos to, since we are copying at the moment. Normally, that would be my Photos external hard drive. For this purpose, it's actually a demo images folder that's within my pictures folder. I could always click the other destination option here if I need to navigate to some other storage location, if it's not on the list here, for example. So I'll go ahead and choose that primary location. So I talked about the naming of folders and the approach that we might use, the strategy for folder structure. We haven't dealt with that issue just yet in the context of import. Right now, we're just identifying the top level storage location for our images. And then taking a quick look at the settings on the right panel here in file handling, I recommend standard previews. Ignore the first 2 options. So it's either standard or 1-to-1. You only really need 1-to-1 if you tend to zoom in on most of your photos. If you're like me and you don't tend to zoom in on all that many, only the ones that you really think have promise, then I would build the standard previews. 1-to-1 previews will be generated each time you do zoom in. That might slow things down a little bit, but it saves the extra storage space required for the larger previews. So I use standard. I don't build smart previews. I don't leverage those in the develop module, for example. I don't work when my hard drive is disconnected, and so I don't feel the need to take advantage of that. I do love the option to not import suspected duplicates, just in case you put a media card into the card reader, not realizing you had already imported those photos into Lightroom Classic. This simple little checkbox will save you from accidentally importing the same photos twice, which obviously having duplicates can be a bit of a frustration. So that's an option I recommend having turned on. I also recommend turning on the option to make a second copy, to create a backup copy, so that when I'm downloading from my media card, I'm not only copying to my Photos external hard drive, I'm copying somewhere else as well. And typically, the primary copy is going to an external hard drive. And so what I do is I just create a backup folder on the desktop within my operating system and use that for the backup. I treat this, by the way, as a temporary backup, because it doesn't have the same folder structure as my overall photo organization. The folder instead will say imported on and the date of import. And so I treat that as just a little temporary backup to give me some peace of mind until I've had the opportunity to go through my normal backup workflow. We can add to a collection. I don't take advantage of that option at import, at least not in most situations. So I'll just leave that checkbox turned off. I might use collections later in my workflow, of course, for organizing photos for a particular project. If we want to rename the photos, we can turn on the rename files checkbox and then select a template. There's a variety of templates that are available. You can also choose edit. I'll just bring that up briefly here so that you can see that we can define essentially these tokens for the structure. So here I have custom text and then a dash and then a sequence number, which happens to be 4 digits. Note there is a default, this custom name sequence option, that's a 1-digit sequence number. It will automatically go to 2 digits when you get up to 10 and 3 digits when you get to 100, etc. But that means that also the photos won't sort properly in alphabetical order. So I use a larger number of digits. We can go all the way up to 5 digits if you'd like there. And you can insert, so I could, let's say I wanted to, for some reason, add my, well, let's say camera serial number or something. I can add another dash there, and then I can go find the additional metadata. So I can go find the serial number for the camera or the exposure bias or the ISO rating, whatever other details I might want to include in the file name structure. So let's go ahead and say that we wanted the serial number for some reason. I could redefine that structure with those tokens, just using the various metadata that's available to create a structure. But I'm going to keep it simple here. I'll just click cancel and stick with that custom text and 4-digit and sequence number. And so the custom text, we'll call this Palouse 2022. And the starting number, of course, is going to be 1. We'll leave the file name extensions as they are. And then down below, you'll see we have the apply during import section. Remember that develop preset that I created. So I'll go to my develop presets and choose my Tim Gray import develop preset. And one of my favorite settings in the entirety of the import dialog is the ability to assign a metadata preset at import. My copyright information, my contact information, and most importantly, that red color label. So I'm going to go to my pop-up for metadata, choose Tim Gray import. I can also add some keywords. This isn't an option that we're really able to leverage all that well in most cases, because whatever keywords we type in here will be applied to every single image that I'm importing. So I can't use, for example, barn as a keyword, because while some of these photos contain a barn, some of the photos don't. And I can't use crop duster for the same reason. Let's see, this is the Palouse. I could enter in Palouse, but of course, and I'll go ahead and do that, in fact, Palouse. But because these keywords apply equally to all of the photos, they're also not going to be the most helpful keywords. And in fact, can I even use, in this case, just a quick scan, I believe I could still use Washington State, because I don't believe any of these photos happen to be when I crossed the border over into Idaho. So, I could use that as a keyword. I won't bother adding that for the moment. But the point is that you need to be very careful about the keywords at this stage, because they're all going to be applied to all of the photos. But you can separate those keywords by comma, if you'd like, for example, so that you can add multiple keywords. And then we get down to the destination section. This is an important one. And, you might immediately say, well, wait a minute, we already defined the destination up at the top. But again, at the top right, that was just the general storage location for our photos. Now we're defining the specific folder that we're going to use. And so I want to create a subfolder, and then I'll give that a name. So the subfolder will be called Palouse 2022, and I'm organizing into one folder. Now, if you're a date-based person, you might want to use a date-based, an automatic date-based folder structure. Be very careful if you do. Generally, what that would mean is that you're selecting up at the top right, the general location where you're storing all of your photos. Then you're not organizing into a subfolder, but instead you're creating folders by date, and you can then choose a folder structure with the date format pop-up. And the key thing to keep in mind here is that a slash represents a folder or a subfolder, and a dash represents a dash. And so just to take a look at one example here, the top item here is a folder called 2022, so a folder based on the year, and then a subfolder that has the month 08 for August and the day 02 for the second, separated by a dash. That's going to be one folder called 0802, 08-02. We could also create folders just by month or folders for individual days. So here we would have a year folder, a month folder numerically, and a day folder. And those dates, of course, would reflect the capture time for your photos. So here it's the date of the live presentation, but under normal circumstances, of course, once I import, probably I didn't capture all of the photos today. Some of them might be from yesterday or the day before, or what have you. And so there'll be folders created based on whatever the capture times were. But again, I'm going to choose into subfolder, into one folder, just to keep it simple for my purposes and based on the way I think about my photos. All right, so that takes care of our overall settings. And I think it's important to keep in mind, to consider, we're doing a lot here. We are copying our photos. We're making sure that we're not importing duplicates. We're making a second backup copy. We're renaming, we're updating the develop settings, updating some metadata, including, oh, I just noticed I typed Palouse wrong in the keywords, so I'll fix that as long as we're reviewing, creating a subfolder. I'm doing a lot in one step here. And so I'm going to go ahead and click the import button at the bottom right, and Lightroom Classic will get to work importing the photos, copying the images. Notice in the grid view display here, you can see those red color labels, more on that shortly, but we're able to update the metadata, just a wide variety of things that are happening, being pretty efficient essentially in getting a lot done with one dialog. And again, with that red color label, I know that these photos have not yet been reviewed. While that's happening, maybe I want to go take a look at some of my other photos and, review some different images from different locations. And then I might get distracted and, caught up working on an image. And then I forget that I actually had more images to review. Where were those photos? It was from a recent trip. Where did I go? And so you'll notice, I have this Palouse 2022 folder, but I don't have any way at the moment of kind of remembering. A month from now, I might go into that folder and look in the grid view display, for example, say, wait, what are all these red color labels doing? That means I've not yet reviewed these photos. How did I forget to go back and review these photos after that trip? Well, in addition to assigning that red color label to the individual photos, I like to take advantage of another really cool feature here in Lightroom Classic, and that is to assign a red color label to the folder. Right-clicking on a folder, then I can choose the option to add a color label to that folder, and in this case, red, of course, so that I get this little marker out to the right side so that I've got a hopefully fairly clear reminder that that folder has not yet been reviewed, that it contains photos that in turn also have a red color label. So I want to go through and review those. I do want, before I actually show you the review process, I want to show you the quick and easy way. I'm going to put a different card into the card reader here and show you a variation on that import and show you really how quick this overall process can be. First, let me go check, because Lightroom's not going to check for me in terms of what the actual number, the number of the last image in the sequence. So I've got to remember that 72 is the next number, 71 is the last image. Don't even get me started on why Lightroom doesn't remember this for me, doesn't figure it out for me automatically. But to quickly import more photos into the same location, instead of going down to the import button, I'm going to go to the folder in question, this Palouse 2022 folder, right-click and choose the option to import to this folder. And did that card show up? Yes, good. So now, same basic source, the media card essentially. I'm still copying at the top center, the same folder, but now notice it's targeting that specific folder that I right-clicked on. So that Palouse 2022 folder. So my destination set pretty simply, pretty automatically, essentially. And the settings here in file handling, all the same. File renaming, great, all the same, except it left the start number at 1, and I need that to be 72. And all my other settings, notice the keywords get cleared out. That might seem like a bug, but actually the idea here is it's better to not assign keywords than to assign keywords without realizing it to photos from a completely different trip, for example. So I'll just type in Palouse, I'll spell it correctly this time. And in this case, I think actually, oh no, these photos were in Idaho. So if I had been using Washington State as a keyword, I would need to not do that with this particular batch of photos. And then I don't need the subfolder because again, we're importing directly into that Palouse 2022 folder. And so again, just to sort of underscore, number one, there's that shortcut for importing directly to a folder. And that once you get familiar with import, and once you don't need me there talking about all these different settings for an extended period of time, It's pretty quick and easy to establish and confirm those settings. Click the import button and you're on your way to reviewing your photos. And then the actual review process. So let me bring up a slide here with my star rating definitions, because I think this is helpful. To me, in theory, a 1-star rating means bad and 5-star means amazing. But I don't feel like it's worth my time to assign a 1-star rating to a bad image. And so I take an approach where a 1-star rating is essentially my kind of baseline. And so I wanted to share with you kind of the general way that I think about star ratings, just so you can have some sense of the approach here. Don't think of these as being too literal. It's just a way to kind of wrap your head around the concepts that I use in assigning these star ratings. So 1 star, it's a keeper. It's a photo that I think I'm going to work with. It's not an outtake. It's not something that I want to delete, but it also, if I don't assign a star rating to an image, doesn't mean it needs to be deleted. It just means I don't think I'm going to work with this one, but I might want to keep it around for a little while. So 1 star, those are the yeses. Those are the images that I think I'm going to work with. I think of 2 stars as being one of my best photos from a particular trip or a particular photo outing, whatever the case might be. 3 stars is sort of best of the year. Doesn't have to be literally a calendar year, but the basic concept. 4 stars would be something like best of the decade. And then 5 stars would be my absolute best ever photos. These are my portfolio images. So just to give you some sense of the approach that I use and recommend that you consider for star ratings, taking kind of a different approach to what might be the automatic assumed names for those reasons for those star ratings, motivations for the star ratings, taking a little bit of a different approach. All right. And so then when it comes time to review, I've got my images, I've navigated to the folder, I have my red color labels reminding me that these images need to be reviewed. And so I would typically switch to the loop view display. You can just double click on a thumbnail, for example. And then I go through these photos, and I'll just kind of quickly go through a basic process here. And so let's say, well, this image, it's just not that strong. I'm going to press the letter X on the keyboard to assign a reject flag, meaning this is a photo that I want to delete. I'm not going to delete it right now because I don't want to interrupt my workflow in that way. And so I'll just press X and move on. So I'll use the right arrow key to move on. Maybe this one could be deleted as well, but I'll just leave it there, not assign a star to it. That one's good, but I think this one with some more blue sky is better. So I'll press 1 on the keyboard to assign a 1-star rating. And then, we've got some essentially outtakes that I don't think I need to delete. And that one I like, so 1 star, and that one gets a 1 star, and maybe that one. And, again, just going through the images here and deciding, if there's one, that one looks a little fuzzy, so I'm going to press X to delete. That one I think is a little tiny bit soft as well. That one looks kind of cool, so 1-star rating. And again, just going through image by image and assigning 1 star to the images you want to keep. Notice I'm not even thinking about 2, 3, 4, and 5 stars. This initial review, it's just 1 star or nothing in terms of stars, or the letter X on the keyboard if I feel that the image should be deleted. We'll stop at that level with that image. And so now up through, in this case, it happens to be image number 35, I've reviewed, and I'm going to stop for a moment. I'm not going to finish reviewing the rest of the photos, but I want to identify the fact that these images have been reviewed. So I'm going to scroll back to the beginning, hold the Shift key on the keyboard, and click on the first image. And then very important, I'm going to switch to the grid view display by pressing the letter G on the keyboard. By default, if you're in the loop view display and you update metadata, you're only updating that single image that you see in the loop view. If you want to update multiple images, you'll want to be in the grid view display. There's other options, but I recommend just switching to the grid view display. So here in the grid view, I have multiple images selected, and so I can change metadata. In this case, I want to remove the red color label. For color labels, red happens to have a keyboard shortcut of the number 6 on the keyboard, and it's a toggle. So if I press it, it will add the color label, then remove the color label, etc. So here, the color label is already assigned. I press 6. That removes the color label from those selected images. If I scroll down a little bit here, you'll see that I still have some other images that have that color label still assigned. So when I'm ready to review some more photos, then I'll start off with the next image that has, the first image that still has a red color label. And then along the way, at any stage, as we're reviewing the photos, you might say, you know, this was a particularly good trip. I have a lot of really good images in this particular folder. Similar to the color label that we can assign to a folder, we can also mark a folder as a favorite. So if this folder happens to be one that you think contains a lot of really great images, then you can right-click once again on the folder and choose Mark Favorite. And as long as we're talking about that later, when I am finished reviewing all of the photos in this folder, and therefore I've removed all of the red color labels from all images in the folder, I can later right-click and choose the Add Color Label to Folder option, followed by None. So I'm adding a None color label, essentially, which is the same as removing that red color label. So just so that you're aware later in your workflow, then you could go through that process as well. And of course, again, you know, naturally at some point reviewing the rest of these photos, later you might come back, of course, and the approach that I typically take when it comes to upgrading star ratings is that I'll filter my images based on a 1-star rating. So here are the images in this particular folder that I assigned a 1-star rating to, and then I'll consider whether I want to upgrade any of these to a 2-star rating. I really love these kind of hazy layers types of effects at sunset. So I'll press the number 2 on the keyboard to assign a 2-star rating to that one. And I like this thistle, nice clean background. So I'll press the number 2 to upgrade that image to a 2-star rating as well. And so as I'm reviewing the photos from a trip, you know, after I've gone through that 1-star review pass, then I might come back and check some of the images. Sometimes I'll wait until I've worked with an image in the develop module, or wait until I've shared an image to Instagram to see what sort of feedback I get, or I'll ask my wife what she thinks and she'll tell me it's still just a 1-star image, or, you know, whatever the case might be. But the point is that I'll use that 1-star review initially, and then later in my workflow, I'll gradually start to increase the star ratings as I've had some time to kind of sit with the images a little bit more, spend time working with them, maybe make a print, etc. And then the other aspect here that I can do really at any time is to delete those rejected photos. So when I press the letter X on the keyboard to assign a reject flag to the image, you'll notice that the image on the film strip down here, or if we have a similar scenario up in the grid view display, then the rejected photos will have a couple of things possibly. First is a reject flag. So this little flag with an X, and it's there on the film strip as well. And then on the film strip, you'll notice that the thumbnail gets dimmed down and for the non-selected image, as well as within my grid view display. Obviously, if I click on an image, it's going to get selected, and therefore be brightened up again, you might say. But so I get this sort of visual indication of the images that have been rejected. I could certainly set a filter for those images as well. But there's a simple way, you know, once I've gone through and I'm comfortable that any image that I've assigned a reject flag to that I actually want to get rid of, I can go up to the menu and choose Photo, followed by Delete Rejected Photos. It's important to keep in mind that this command only operates on the current folder. And so if I have photos from another trip that I had rejected, but I don't feel quite yet ready to delete, I don't need to worry about that. This is only for the current folder. So just make sure that you've navigated to the appropriate folder that you want to delete photos for. And then from the photo menu, you can choose Delete Rejected Photos. And that will set a filter so that you can see in the background here the rejected photos. Not as helpful as it might seem, because as soon as you have enough images that have been rejected that it more than fills up the available space, then you're not able to scroll, because we have this dialogue that's preventing us from scrolling around and interacting with the Lightroom Classic interface. So if you're not sure, set a filter for rejected images, go through and review those images, and make sure you're comfortable deleting. And then we can use that command, so Photo, Delete Rejected Photos from the menu. And as is always the case when we choose the option to delete photos with the various commands that are available, we'll get this confirmation dialog where the default is to just remove from Lightroom. In other words, to only remove from the catalog, but leave the source files out on the hard drive. I don't think that makes any sense, because now you don't even know these photos exist, but they're still taking up space on your hard drive. And so if you're sure you want to get rid of the photos, my recommendation is to delete from the disk. That removes them from the Lightroom Classic catalog, but it also deletes the files from your hard drive. If you're not comfortable deleting photos from your hard drive, in my opinion, you should also not be comfortable removing them from your Lightroom Classic catalog. So wait until you're totally sure you want to get rid of those images. If you're not sure, you can click the cancel button, of course, to not delete. But if you're going to remove, I recommend deleting from the disk. So I'll choose that command. And now we have the images, those rejected images deleted. I obviously still haven't finished my workflow reviewing all of the other images that need to be reviewed, but hopefully I've got plenty of time in the coming days to get that work done. The other thing that you might consider is to assign some keywords to selected images. And I recommend keeping in mind that with keywords, there's sort of two directions involved. What I mean by that is, first and foremost, keywords can be used to locate images. If I want a picture of an airplane, I can filter images based on keyword airplane. Or if I want photos of flowers, I can go to my keyword of flowers. And so we can search for images that have a particular keyword. The other advantage, the other potential use for keywords is reminding yourself of what a subject actually was. And so in this case, fairly straightforward subjects. You know, we've got barns and metal wheels and the crop duster airplane and etc. Let's say, for example, maybe you're not familiar with this crop, and so you don't know what it is. Well, if you had assigned a keyword, you'd have that reminder. So keywords are both for tracking down an image that you're looking for based on subject matter, for example, but also to remind yourself when you pull up this photo and someone says, oh, what is that crop? Well, let's go look in the keywords. Oh, I don't know. I need to add a keyword so that I'll remember that this happens to be a canola crop, for example. And so, of course, I'm going to review a couple of the ways that you can assign keywords, but I'm also going to show you a way that I think you'll find helpful in many situations. So first off, in the keywording section, I can just click. It's a little faint, but it says click here to add keywords. And I'll type canola, for example. And I can separate keywords by comma. So maybe I want to put flower and crop, since this is an actual crop field. And then I'll press enter or return on the keyboard in order to assign those keywords. And then all of the keywords in the larger field here will then appear in alphabetical order. We could also, let's say I'm going to assign keywords to this image. Another option is to go to the keyword list. And especially if you're concerned about spelling errors, this is a good way to go. It can be not quite as fast. Well, for me, not quite as fast because I'm able to touch type fairly quickly. But well, actually, we saw during import, I spelled Palouse wrong. I somehow left out the letter L in Palouse. So obviously, even though I can type, I do make mistakes. And the keyword list is one way to help you avoid some of those mistakes. And the idea is we can go to the keyword list, and I can go and find the keywords that I want to assign. So for example, there's canola. I can also filter this list. So if you have a long list of keywords, there's a filter field up at the top. So I can type, canola, for example, and there's canola, and then I just turn on the checkbox for the keywords that I want to assign. I'll go ahead and just clear out that search, and I'll just quickly go find crop and what else? Flower we were using, and I think that was it for this particular subject matter. In any event, and again, you can obviously be as thorough as you want with keywords. Generally, I assign keywords to my favorite photos, so I'll typically filter by star rating when I'm going to assign keywords, and I try to make sure to identify based on what I think I might be searching for later, as well as what I might want to be reminded of later. So just keep that in mind as you're keywording. One last thing I want to show for keywording is an option that a lot of photographers like to sort of make fun of, but that I think can be very helpful, and that is the painter. And so on the toolbar down below the grid view display, there's a little spray can. That's our painter that we can use to essentially paint metadata. I'm going to paint keywords. There's some other options from the pop-up here. And let's start. I know we had a crop duster in there. We'll start with crop duster as the keyword that we're assigning here. And the idea then is that I can paint on the images. So let's go find some crop dusters. And so here we have some images of crop dusters. So I've got my painter activated with keyword of crop duster. This could be multiple keywords. In fact, let's do that. I'll make it crop duster, comma, airplane, comma, aerial application. That's a term that's often used for crop dusting. And so now when I click on an image, those keywords in this case could be one, could be multiple, separated by commas. That keyword will be added to the image. Part of the reason that I find this helpful is that I can kind of just scroll through fairly quickly and just find the subject. Oh, here's some more. Just find the subject. Focus on one thing at a time, kind of an assembly line type of a process. But the other cool thing here is that in addition to clicking on individual images, I can click and drag. It is a spray painter after all. So I'll start up here on this image and I'll click and drag to the left and then downward. And notice I get that little white box around the image indicating that it has been painted essentially. And I'll scroll down here quickly and there's a couple more, a few more crop dusters, a couple more right there. And here's a handful more, a couple there. And again, I could obviously then switch my keywords to something else and assign keywords to different images. And so barn, and there's a handful of barns there, and we saw other barns on the list of thumbnails here as well. But again, the point being, so we can use that painter to more quickly pick one subject at a time, and you can kind of quickly go through and paint those keywords, in this case, onto the image. When you're finished, you can either put the painter back into its little circular holder there, or click the done button at the far right of the toolbar for the image, below the grid view display. All right, and I know we're just about out of time, and I suspect there's probably at least a couple of questions that I'll be happy to answer. But again, just taking into account, we want to try to be as streamlined as possible and as efficient as possible. So what I've tried to share with you today is the workflow that I use for managing my own images, that sort of initial part of the workflow, importing the photos, reviewing the photos, identifying favorites. And what I find is that this simple approach enables me to find the photo I'm looking for the vast majority of the time, very often simply by selecting a particular folder, if I have a clue of where that image might be, and then setting a filter based on star rating. So let me go browse, and it could be multiple folders. So if I want to go see images from Austria, but I'm not sure which year, I could select multiple folders, click one folder, and then hold the Shift key and click on the other folder, or the Command or Control key to toggle folders as being selected or not selected. And then again, setting a filter based on star rating. That gets me there most of the time. The color label, the red color label, helps to make sure that I actually review all of my photos, hopefully, including the color label for the folder to help that stand out just a little bit better. All right, so Scott, do we have some questions?
Yeah, no questions, Tim. None.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
No, I just assumed that meant that I was extremely clear in everything that I explained and nobody had any confusion whatsoever.
Oh, come on. We've got questions, Tim. We wouldn't let you off the hook that easy.
I didn't figure.
So I guess let's start with we'll start with the easiest and go to the hardest. How's that sound?
I love easy. Yeah.
Excellent. Wonderful. So Joe on Vimeo wanted to know, can you stop an import if you need to? Started copying more than he wanted to. Is there a way to just stop it mid-import?
You can. It's not like instantly responsive, but while you're importing photos, you may have noticed up at the top left, there's a little status bar, and it'll actually show with the example, the settings that I've used here, it'll show you two status bars eventually, one for the actual import of copying photos and the other for building of the previews. Building previews usually takes a bit longer. So if you click that pop-up, you'll see the two tasks, and then over to the right, you can click an X to cancel. It still will have copied a fair number of photos probably, so you'll have to kind of reconnect all of that. It might in some cases be easier to just let them all import and then move them to a different folder or delete some of the images later, just so that you're not kind of interrupting that process. But the answer is that you can with that X on the status indicator.
Awesome. Now, Linda want to know, is she able to come back at a later time and add photos to a folder that she just created?
Absolutely. So if we were importing new photos, if you'd gone out and captured additional images, then you could always use that little trick of just right-clicking on the folder itself and importing to this folder. If another trick that can be helpful, that kind of a variation on a theme, the example I gave earlier of scanned images would probably fit well in that regard. So let's pretend that this Palouse folder actually contained images that I scanned from a very early trip to the Palouse where I used film. And I've scanned images and saved them into that same folder. I can also then right click on the folder and choose the option to synchronize the folder. And that will cause Lightroom to go look for new photos in that folder that you can then bring into your catalog. So if you've got an example of, for maybe in my demo images folder, for example, I might out on the hard drive save additional images. I've scanned some slides or what have you, then I can synchronize a folder as well. So a couple of different ways you could approach that depending on the particular.
Great. Ted's asking, is there another way to remove color labels, such as selecting images and then right clicking on them?
Yes, you certainly could. So and there's, as always, several approaches that you could use. So we can go up to the menu. So if we go up onto the metadata menu, no, it's on the photo menu, actually. I never use this, so you can see. So photo menu, set color label, and then choose an appropriate option. We can also find the same thing if we right click on the image. And if I find there is set color label, because I don't use that. I'm a fan of keyboard shortcuts. So set color label and set that as appropriate for the images. So obviously several ways that you could approach that.
Wonderful. Now, Kirsten is asking, can you show how to filter by keyword?
Yeah, so a couple of different options, but I would say the easiest is right here on the keyword list. And so let's say, well, we were talking about the crop duster. I go find that keyword. If you hover your mouse over a keyword, you'll see a little arrow over to the far right, and just click, and that will take you to a filter. Now notice this is using the library filter bar, the metadata tab, setting one of our columns to keyword. So obviously this would be another way you could approach it. Go to the library filter above the grid view display, select the metadata tab, set one of these columns using the pop-up at the column header to keyword, and then go find the keyword you want. There's also, not that you need even more options, but there's a text search on the library filter bar where you could search for basically any available metadata, but you could make that specific to keywords if you wanted to. But again, I would say, as far as I'm concerned, the fastest, easiest way is just click that option over on the right side. That will give you all images. And so if you wanted that by a particular folder, we could. So I'm going to go select that filter. So we have our filter set up at the top right of the library filter bar. Notice I have my lock turned on, so I can click to unlock the filter or lock the filter. If I have that filter locked, now, again, notice that I was taken automatically to all photographs. I could go look at just an individual folder if I wanted to, and the filter criteria will remain because I have that lock turned on.
Great. We've got so many questions. Tim, we're gonna just extend this to a 2-hour event. Tim's like, no, I've got places to go, guys. We'll get through some more. Matt did ask, I think, a great question here. Would love to know if Tim's got any tips for speeding up Lightroom, especially with larger raw files. It's always kind of a little bit slow and cumbersome for the selection culling process.
Yeah, so part of that depends on your particular workflow. So if you're zooming in on the images a lot, so if you're having a tendency, to click to zoom in and see if the image is sharp, and on many of your images, that requires the one-to-one preview. So that can be sped up using, obviously, building those one-to-one previews on import for that folder for the images that you're bringing in. Making sure that you've got plenty of available hard drive space, a really fast hard drive. So the catalog and the previews by default are going to be on your internal hard drive, and that's generally going to give you the best performance. But making sure that that's, for example, an SSD drive that is going to have even faster performance. And so trying to essentially make sure that Lightroom is able to work as quickly as possible. Some photographers prefer to have their catalog on an external hard drive along with their photos, so they can more easily move the catalog to a different computer. That's generally going to be a fair bit slower than just working on an internal hard drive. And so, upgrading your computer isn't a terrible idea. In the library module, there's not a whole lot else you can do because we're not able to take advantage of, for example, smart previews the way we can in the develop module, meaning that the smart previews aren't necessary in the library module. But so the smart previews that are an advantage in the develop module, if you're taking advantage of that feature, that doesn't exist in the library module. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that you can do beyond just general performance tips. Having the catalog on an internal hard drive that's as fast as possible, and and those sorts of things. There's not a lot otherwise to kind of soup things up in the library module.
Awesome. Now this is a comment, not a question, really. Well, it's kind of one and the same. But Richard wants you to come back and do a session on syncing to the cloud. So just a recommendation, something we can talk about. We're gonna have to wrangle Tim back into the event space and force him.
There you go.
to come back. We'll get a few more questions answered, and then we'll let Tim go on his way, because otherwise, I'm sure we could be here all day. There's so many things.
I'm sure.
Kind of divulge into in Lightroom and Lightroom Classic.
Right.
Stephanie wanted to know, she noticed that your main folders don't show the total count of photos in the subfolders, which isn't how hers seems to look. Can you talk about how you set that up?
Certainly. And actually, a good example here would be the Palouse trips. And I thought, actually, when you started giving me that question, it's going to be about this Palouse folder that seems out of place. Because while I typically use a fairly flat folder structure, when I've made multiple trips to the same location, for example, then I'll start to group folders together. And so you can see, obviously, again, this is a demo catalog. I actually have something like, a dozen folders from Austria and dozens of folders from New York City and probably a dozen or so from the Palouse. They're not all represented here, but when I have a fair number of those folders that are from similar locations, then I'll group them into a parent folder. And so really, in this case, the Palouse 2022 folder can go into this parent Palouse trips folder. So I'll just drag and drop. Yes, we can move photos and folders and rename them right inside of Lightroom Classic. We don't need to make that mistake of going outside of Lightroom. And then I'll click the move button to confirm that I want to actually move those photos. And Stephanie's point here is that we're seeing the count of the photos within each of these folders, but for that parent folder, it's showing 0. And perhaps more alarmingly, if I click on that folder, it says no photos. Oh no, where did all my Palouse pictures go? Don't panic yet. The photos they're actually there. The option that I personally prefer to turn off, some photographers prefer to have it. Apparently, maybe Stephanie prefers to have it enabled, or maybe she's going to go turn it off now. But if we go to the library menu, there's an option for show photos in subfolders. The reason I usually recommend turning this off is that it can lead to confusion. It can lead you to think that there is duplication. So I go to the Palouse 2016 folder, and I see this crop duster photo. And then I go to the Palouse trips folder. Oh, it's the same image. It's in 2 folders. I guess I could delete it. That's not the case. I've enabled the option to show photos in subfolders so that, in effect, you can think of my Palouse trips folder in this case as being a window to all of the folders below. And therefore, you'll also see that the number to the right shows me the total. So if we added these 3 numbers up, 216, 109, and 142, I'm sure everybody's got their calculators out and is double checking that. It will add, I can confidently say, even though I didn't confirm, that it will add up to 467. And you'll see similarly for these other parent folders now, the count of all folders down below, all subfolders. And what do I have a filter set here? Yes, I do. So with a filter set here, I'm confusing myself even further, but we have then individual folders as well as the parent. And so again, just to avoid that confusion of where the photos actually exist, where are they really? Is this folder empty, or does it actually contain some photos? I prefer to turn that off. So I turn off library, show photos in subfolders. And if I want the equivalent of that, essentially, then I would just go and select multiple folders from the list. So click on the first folder and shift click on the last folder, for example. And we still then would have a tally of the total number of photos being displayed right now, or that in that collective location. So obviously just a matter of personal preference. When you know how Lightroom works, then obviously you can avoid that confusion just because you're not going to let Lightroom trick you. But that's the reason that's the reason it was different. And those are the reasons that I prefer to have it set differently.
Wonderful. Well, Tim, I want to thank you for being here. Always great to have you. You've got so much information and so much knowledge that you share with us. And so we really appreciate that. If we didn't get to your question, we're sorry, but we've got to let Tim go and otherwise he's just going to be stuck here all day answering our questions. questions, which we would love. And
which we would love.
yes, and we'll make sure to get him back. I promise.
Absolutely.
Where can people find you? What do you have coming up next? Workshops, things like that. What's going on for Tim Gray?
Well, first off, thank you everybody for joining us. So if I can bring this up. There we go. So thank you for joining me for today's presentation. I hope you found it helpful in terms of getting a more streamlined workflow in Lightroom Classic. You can learn more about everything I'm doing at timgrayphoto.com. One of the things I did not mention, by the way, is I imagine many of you are already familiar. I do publish my Ask Tim Gray email newsletter with a question and answer, a photographer's question, my answer every weekday morning. And I've been publishing that email newsletter, hard to believe, over 20 years now. Going on 21 years this November. So just amazing. I guess not amazing that there's still a lot of questions, but amazing that photographers are still welcoming my emails into their inbox, I suppose. But one of the options there, if you'd like, you can sign up for the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. And that's also where I announce any upcoming presentations. I'll certainly be back in the B&H event space for another virtual presentation in the not too distant future. I do love that subject of synchronization because there's some different angles and twists and turns there that can be very interesting. And I do also present webinars on my own. Those are announced in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter. And then recordings, if you're not able to attend live, do get added to my YouTube channel, which you can check out at youtube.com/timgraytv. And so the main page here will be timgrayphoto.com, and there you can find me on social media, follow me on Instagram, and see what's going on. Gray Learning, where I publish a variety of video training courses to help you understand Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, photography, and more.
Awesome, wonderful. I was going to say, actually, you didn't mention the newsletter. I was almost disappointed. I'm glad you brought it up. I'm glad you brought it up. And I just want to leave everybody with a note that if you do want to rewatch this, because there was a ton of great information, and I'm sure that people are going to want to dissect it and really be able to not regurgitate, to let it sink in. Let it sink in, the opposite of regurgitate. You can check it out on vimeo.com/BH Event Space, or you can go to Facebook, either the B&H Event Space Facebook page or just the regular B&H photo page. We'll have it up there as well. But I want to say thanks again to Tim, as well as all of our viewers, for tuning in today. That is all the time we have for now, but we look forward to seeing you soon. This has been another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. We'll catch you next time.